The autopsy report would later reveal that all 3 wounds were placed with surgical precision. Each one avoids vital organs by mere millimeters, ensuring maximum pain while keeping the victims conscious for as long as possible. The medical examiner had never seen anything like it in 23 years on the job. What he didn't know was that the person responsible had spent 4 years studying human anatomy at Johns Hopkins before trading her stethoscope for combat boots. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Staff Sergeant Jerica Blackwood adjusted her Kevlar vest one final time as the Humvee rolled through the dusty streets of Kandahar. The Afghan sun blazed overhead, turning the armored vehicle into a mobile oven. She'd been deployed for 8 months now, leading a medical unit attached to the 82nd Airborne Division. What started as a calling to save lives had evolved into something far more complex. Before the army, Jerica had been on track to become a trauma surgeon. She graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern with a degree in pre-med, then spent 4 grueling years at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Her professors praised her steady hands and encyclopedic knowledge of human anatomy. She could identify every nerve cluster, every pressure point, every vulnerable spot on the human body with her eyes closed. But medical school debt was crushing, and her father's cancer treatment had drained the family's savings. When the army offered to pay off her loans in exchange for 6 years of service as a combat medic, it seemed like the perfect solution. She could serve her country, eliminate her debt, and gain invaluable trauma experience before returning to civilian medicine. The transition from sterile operating rooms to battlefield medicine had been jarring at first. In Baltimore, she'd had endless supplies, state-of-the-art equipment, and attending physicians to guide her decisions. Here in Afghanistan, she worked with whatever supplies they could scrounge, often performing life-saving procedures in bombed-out buildings or the back of moving vehicles. Her unit respected her immediately. While other medics relied on basic field training, Jerica brought the knowledge of someone who understood exactly how the human body worked and how to fix it when things went wrong. She could stop bleeding that others couldn't, find veins when traditional methods failed, and perform procedures that saved lives other medics would have written off. The locals in their sector had started calling her the Angel of Kandahar. The word spread that the American female medic could work miracles. Families would travel for miles, sometimes crossing dangerous territory, just to bring their injured loved ones to her aid station. But Afghanistan changed people, and Jerica was no exception. The first incident happened during her 5th month of deployment. Their convoy had been hit by an IED, and Private Martinez was bleeding out from shrapnel wounds to his abdomen. As Jerica worked frantically to save him, insurgents began firing on their position. She could hear bullets whistling overhead as she tried to clamp a severed artery. That's when she noticed him, a Taliban fighter positioned behind a crumbling wall about 50 yards away. He was young, maybe 18, with a rifle aimed directly at her position. For a moment, their eyes met across the battlefield. He had a clear shot. All he had to do was pull the trigger. Instead, he lowered his weapon and disappeared behind the wall. Later, she would learn from Afghan interpreters that even the Taliban had heard stories of the American doctor who treated anyone who needed help, regardless of which side they were on. 3 weeks earlier, she'd operated on a wounded insurgent who'd been brought to their base by his desperate mother. Word traveled fast in a place where survival often depended on knowing who could be trusted. The second incident was different. Their unit had been tasked with raiding a compound suspected of harboring bomb makers. Intelligence suggested the location was being used to manufacture IEDs targeting American convoys. Jerica's role was supposed to be simple: provide medical support if any soldiers were wounded during the operation. The raid went smoothly at first. They breached the compound at dawn, finding 3 men inside, along with bomb-making materials and detailed maps of convoy routes. But as they were preparing to evacuate, gunfire erupted from a neighboring building. Insurgents had been lying in wait. During the firefight, Sergeant Collins took a round to the shoulder and went down hard. Jerica sprinted across open ground to reach him, dragging him behind cover as bullets shredded the mud wall above their heads. As she worked to stop the bleeding, she noticed movement in her peripheral vision. One of the detained suspects, a thin man in his 30s with intelligent eyes, had managed to partially free himself from the zip-tie restraints. He was edging toward a rifle that had been dropped during the initial breach. In 30 seconds, maybe less, he would be armed and in position to kill Collins while she was focused on treating his wound. Jerica's mind processed the situation with the same clinical precision she brought to medical procedures. She calculated angles, distances, and probabilities. Her sidearm was within reach. She could draw, aim, and fire before he reached the weapon. But as her hand moved toward her holster, something else occurred to her. Her extensive knowledge of human anatomy meant she knew exactly where to place a shot for maximum effectiveness. She could wound him in a way that would immediately incapacitate him without causing permanent damage. Hit the brachial plexus nerve, cluster in his shoulder, and his entire arm would go numb instantly. A shot to the femoral nerve would drop him to the ground, but leave him alive for questioning. Or she could aim somewhere that would ensure he never threatened another American soldier again. The choice took less than 2 seconds to make. Her shot hit him center mass, precisely placed between the 4th and 5th ribs on his left side. He dropped immediately, clutching his chest and gasping, but he was still breathing, still conscious. The bullet had missed his heart by exactly 2 inches, far enough to avoid immediate death, close enough to cause maximum trauma and blood loss. She finished treating Collins's wound with steady hands, then moved to the wounded detainee. As she worked to stabilize him, she felt a strange sense of satisfaction. This wasn't the random chaos of battlefield medicine. This was precise, controlled. She had chosen exactly how much damage to inflict and where to inflict it. The detainee survived the helicopter ride to the field hospital. During his recovery, he provided intelligence that led to the capture of an entire IED cell. The operation was deemed a success, and Jerica received a commendation for her actions under fire. But something had shifted inside her during that firefight. The line between healing and hurting had blurred in a way that felt both disturbing and oddly liberating. As their Humvee continued through the streets of Kandahar, Jerica reflected on how much she'd changed since arriving in Afghanistan. The idealistic medical student who'd wanted to save the world felt like a different person entirely. War had a way of teaching you things about yourself that you never wanted to learn. She just didn't realize yet how much darker those lessons would become. The interrogation room at Forward Operating Base Chapman was a concrete box with fluorescent lights that hummed like angry insects. Jerica sat across from Captain Reynolds, the base's intelligence officer, reviewing medical files from the past 3 months. What had started as a routine debrief about detainee medical care had evolved into something more complex. Your success rate with extracting information during medical treatment is unprecedented, Reynolds said, sliding a folder across the metal table. 93% of wounded prisoners you've treated have provided actionable intelligence during recovery. Jerica kept her expression neutral as she flipped through the reports. Each file detailed how insurgents had volunteered information about weapons caches, planned attacks, and cell structures while under her medical care. What the reports didn't mention was how she'd achieved these results. It had started accidentally. with a Taliban commander named Rashid, who'd been brought in with a gunshot wound to his thigh. While treating him, she'd noticed how he winced when she applied pressure to certain nerve clusters near the wound. His pain responses weren't random. They followed the exact pathways she'd memorized during her neurology rotations at Johns Hopkins. During the procedure to remove bullet fragments, she'd accidentally nicked a nerve bundle that controlled sensation in his leg. Nothing permanent, just enough to cause excruciating pain that would persist for weeks. When Rashid begged her to make it stop, she explained through an interpreter that she could perform a simple procedure to relieve his suffering. All she needed was his cooperation with the intelligence officers. Within 6 hours, Rashid had revealed the locations of 3 weapons depots and provided names of 12 other cell members. The technique had evolved since then. Each prisoner presented a unique anatomical puzzle, and Jerica had become expert at finding their specific vulnerabilities. A pressure point behind the ear that triggered migraines. A nerve cluster in the wrist that caused shooting pain up the arm. Small injuries that appeared accidental but created precisely calibrated levels of discomfort. "We'd like you to work more directly with our interrogation team," Reynolds continued. "Your medical background gives you insights our regular interrogators lack." That evening, Jerica found herself in the base's makeshift gym, working through her frustrations on a heavy bag. Each punch landed with technical precision. She knew exactly which angles would maximize impact, which combinations would overwhelm an opponent's defenses. Her medical training had given her an intimate understanding of human vulnerability that extended far beyond the battlefield. Sergeant Kim approached as she unwrapped her hands. Kim was one of the few other women on the base, a tough military police officer from Detroit who'd earned respect through sheer competence and an unwillingness to back down from anyone. "Heard. Reynolds wants you working interrogations," Kim said, settling onto a nearby bench. "Word travels fast. It does when people start wondering how our detention facility became so cooperative all of a sudden." Kim's tone was careful, neutral. "Some of the MPs have noticed patterns. Prisoners who were defiant suddenly became talkative after spending time in the medical bay. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Jerica continued, unwrapping her hands, not meeting Kim's eyes. "Medical care builds trust. People are grateful when you relieve their pain. Maybe, or maybe someone with extensive knowledge of human anatomy has figured out how to cause very specific types of pain." The conversation hung between them for a long moment. Jerica had always respected Kim's directness, but this felt like dangerous territory. "Are you asking me something specific, Sergeant?" Kim stood up, adjusting her gear belt. "I'm telling you that people notice things, and right now, what they're noticing is working in our favor. Just remember that wars end, and we all have to live with what we did when we get home." 2 weeks later, Jerica found herself working directly with the interrogation team on a high-value target. The prisoner was Omar Naziri, a suspected bomb maker whose devices had killed 17 American soldiers over the past 4 months. He'd been captured with extensive burns on his hands and arms from an explosion at his safe house. In the interrogation room, Naziri sat chained to a metal chair, his bandaged hands resting on the table. He was older than most fighters, maybe 45, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that tracked every movement in the room. He'd been questioned for 3 days without providing any useful information. Captain Reynolds gestured for Jerica to examine the prisoner's injuries. As she unwrapped the bandages, she assessed the extent of the burns with professional detachment. Second-degree burns across both palms and fingers, some areas approaching third degree. Painful, but not life-threatening with proper care. Listener, burns are healing well, she announced for the record. But I'm concerned about infection in the deeper wounds. We'll need to clean and redress them daily. What happened next wasn't recorded in any official report. As Jerica cleaned the burns, she identified exactly which nerve endings were most exposed, which areas would be most sensitive to pressure or temperature changes. Her touch was clinical, professional, but she paid careful attention to Naziri's reactions. When she pressed gauze against a particular spot on his left palm, his entire body tensed. "This area is particularly vulnerable," she told Reynolds, making sure her voice carried concern rather than calculation. Any contamination here could lead to permanent nerve damage. Over the next hour, she systematically mapped Naziri's pain responses while appearing to provide routine medical care. By the time she finished changing his bandages, she had a complete understanding of how to maximize his discomfort without causing visible harm. The breakthrough came during the third treatment session. As Jerica worked on his wounds, she began asking seemingly innocent questions about his family, his background, his motivations. When he remained silent, she would accidentally apply pressure to the most sensitive areas of his burns. When he started talking, her touch became gentler, more soothing. It was a form of conditioning that bypassed traditional interrogation techniques entirely. His body learned to associate cooperation with pain relief and defiance with increased suffering. Within a week, Naziri had provided detailed information about 3 bomb-making cells, including locations, personnel, and planned targets. The intelligence he provided prevented 2 major attacks on coalition forces and led to the capture of 15 insurgents. Captain Reynolds called it the most successful interrogation in the base's history, but success came with a price. Jerica found herself thinking about pain differently now, not as something to alleviate, but as a tool to be wielded with precision. She began studying her medical textbooks from a new perspective, identifying vulnerabilities instead of treatments, weaknesses instead of strengths. Her sleep became restless, filled with dreams where she performed surgery with clinical detachment. While patients screamed, she woke up each morning with the taste of metal in her mouth and a growing certainty that she was losing something essential about herself. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Where she'd once rushed to relieve suffering, she now calculated how much pain would be most effective. Where she'd once seen patients as people to be healed, she increasingly viewed them as problems to be solved through the precise application of anatomical knowledge. When her deployment ended 8 months later, Jerica returned to the United States. With a chest full of commendations and a mind full of secrets, she'd become exactly what the Army needed. A soldier who could extract information more effectively than any traditional interrogator. But in the process, she'd discovered capabilities that went far beyond anything her medical training had been intended to provide. As the transport plane lifted off from Bagram airfield, carrying her away from Afghanistan and back toward civilian life, Jerica stared out at the desert landscape disappearing below. She was going home with skills that no medical school had ever taught, and a growing understanding that some knowledge, once acquired, could never be forgotten. The VA hospital in Denver felt like another planet after Afghanistan. Clean hallways, unlimited supplies, and patients who complained about waiting 20 minutes for pain medication. Jerica had been back in the States for 6 weeks, working as a trauma nurse while waiting for her discharge papers to be processed. The transition to civilian healthcare was proving more difficult than she'd anticipated. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the emergency department chief, had been impressed enough with Jerica's military medical experience to offer her a permanent position. The pay was decent and the work was straightforward. Patch up car accident victims, treat overdoses, and stabilize patients before surgery. It should have been exactly what she wanted. Instead, she found herself fighting boredom and a growing sense of disconnection from her colleagues. They moved through their routines with predictable efficiency, following protocols that seemed almost quaint after the improvisation required in combat zones. None of them had ever performed surgery while under mortar fire or kept someone alive, using medical supplies scavenged from abandoned buildings. The real problem wasn't the work itself, it was how differently she approached it now. During her second month at the hospital, a suspected gang member was brought in with multiple stabby wounds. Marcus Washington was 19 years old, covered in tattoos, and refused to answer any questions about how he'd been injured. The police officer accompanying him explained that Marcus was a person of interest in several violent crimes, but they'd never been able to make charges stick. As Jerica cleaned and sutured his wounds, she found herself cataloguing vulnerabilities. With the same clinical precision she'd developed in Afghanistan, the stab wound to his shoulder had missed the brachial artery by less than an inch. One of the cuts on his forearm had exposed the ulnar nerve. She could easily, accidentally apply pressure that would cause excruciating pain or numbness that could last for months. The thought disturbed her, but not as much as it should have. Dr. Hendricks approached as she finished bandaging Marcus's injuries. "Good work. The police want to question him once he's stable, but he's not being cooperative. They think he was involved in something serious. 3 drive-by shootings in the past month, all in his neighborhood, all with the same type of ammunition. But he's got alibis for 2 of them, and there's no physical evidence." Jerica looked down at Marcus, who was drifting in and out of consciousness from the pain medication. It would be simple to adjust his treatment in ways that might make him more talkative. A slight reduction in his pain medication would keep him conscious and uncomfortable. A routine examination that involved pressure on sensitive areas could create the right incentive structure. She pushed the thoughts away and focused on completing her documentation. This wasn't Afghanistan. This was a civilian hospital with oversight regulations and consequences for crossing ethical lines. But the knowledge of what she could do remained, like a tool she couldn't put down. 3 weeks later, the boundaries became more flexible. Detective Ray Morrison had been working gang violence in Denver for 8 years, and he'd developed a reputation for closing difficult cases through persistence and unconventional methods. When he learned that a former military medic was treating several of his suspects, he arranged a meeting over coffee near the hospital. "I've been reviewing your service record," Morrison said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Impressive stuff, especially your work with prisoner interrogations in Afghanistan." Jerica kept her expression neutral. "I provided medical care to detainees, that's all." "Right, medical care that happened to result in an unusually high rate of cooperation with intelligence gathering." Morrison leaned back in his chair. "I'm not judging. We're fighting the same war, just on different fronts." "What do you want, Detective?" "Information. These gang shootings are escalating and we're not making progress through traditional channels. The kids we arrest either lawyer up immediately or claim they don't know anything, but they all end up in your ER eventually." Morrison slid a business card across the table. "I'm not asking you to do anything unethical. Just keep your eyes and ears open. Sometimes people say things when they're hurt and scared that they wouldn't say in an interrogation room." Jerica pocketed the card without committing to anything. But over the following weeks, she found herself paying closer attention to the conversations happening around injured suspects. Gang members often arrived with friends or family who spoke more freely than the patients themselves. She began taking note of names, relationships, and details that might be relevant to ongoing investigations. The first time she called Morrison with information, it felt like crossing a small line. She'd overheard 2 teenagers discussing which corners were hot due to police attention, information that helped Morrison's team adjust their patrol patterns to catch dealers in the act. The second call involved more direct action. A suspected drug dealer named Carlos Vega had been brought in with a broken arm after a motorcycle accident. While setting his cast, Jericho learned from his girlfriend that he was planning to move a large shipment the following Tuesday. She passed the information to Morrison, who used it to make the largest drug bust in his district that year. By the fourth month, the relationship had evolved into something more systematic. Morrison would provide Jericho with names and photos of suspects he was tracking. When those individuals appeared in her ER, she would find opportunities to gather intelligence during their treatment. Her methods became increasingly sophisticated. She learned to time pain medication to keep suspects alert during crucial conversations. She developed techniques for extending examinations in ways that encouraged patients to talk just to fill the uncomfortable silence. Most importantly, she discovered that people in pain were far more likely to reveal information they might otherwise keep secret. The breakthrough case involved a series of home invasions that had terrorized an upscale Denver neighborhood. 3 elderly residents had been brutally beaten during robberies, and one remained in critical condition. The police had no leads until 22-year-old Devon Pierce was brought to the ER with a severely dislocated shoulder. Pierce claimed he'd injured himself skateboarding, but the injury pattern was consistent with someone being thrown to the ground during a struggle. More importantly, he had scratches on his forearms that looked defensive in nature and traces of what appeared to be expensive jewelry polish under his fingernails. While treating Pierce's shoulder, Jericho engaged him in seemingly casual conversation about his neighborhood, his activities, and his friends. When he remained guarded, she began applying strategic pressure to nerve clusters near his injury. Nothing that would show up on X-rays or raise questions from other medical staff, just precisely targeted discomfort that made him increasingly eager to talk. The technique worked perfectly. Within an hour, Pierce had mentioned specific details about houses in the affected neighborhood, complained about old people who keep too much cash around, and provided names of associates who might be involved in similar activities. The information Jericho passed to Morrison led to arrests that broke up the entire home invasion ring. 3 suspects were charged. Stolen property worth over $200,000 was recovered, and the neighborhood terror campaign ended. Morrison was effusive in his gratitude, but Jericho felt oddly empty about the success. Each victory seemed to require her to move further from the person she'd been when she first entered medical school. The idealistic student who'd wanted to heal people was becoming someone who used medical knowledge to extract information through carefully applied pain. Late at night, alone in her apartment, she would study her old anatomy textbooks and find herself marking pages differently than before. Instead of focusing on how to repair damage, she identified where to cause it most effectively. Instead of memorizing treatment in protocols, she catalogued vulnerabilities and pressure points. The transformation was complete, but she hadn't yet realized where it would ultimately lead. She was still thinking of herself as someone who bent rules for the greater good, someone who used morally questionable methods to achieve righteous ends. She hadn't yet understood that she was becoming something else entirely, something that would soon require very different outlets for the skills she'd developed. The hospital environment, with its oversight and limitations, was beginning to feel as constraining as a cage. And Jericho was starting to think about what might happen if she ever found herself completely free from supervision. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with an anticipation that she was only beginning to recognize as dangerous. The resignation letter sat on Dr. Hendrick's desk for 3 days before Jericho finally submitted it. After 8 months at Denver General, she'd grown restless with the predictability of hospital work and the constant oversight that prevented her from fully utilizing her capabilities. She told her supervisor she was pursuing private consulting opportunities, which wasn't entirely untrue. Detective Morrison had introduced her to Victor Chen, a former FBI agent who now ran a private security firm specializing in corporate investigations. Chen's company, Apex Solutions, worked with Fortune 500 companies dealing with internal theft, industrial espionage, and employee misconduct. They needed someone with Jerica's unique combination of medical knowledge and information extraction skills. The Apex offices occupied 2 floors of a downtown Denver high-rise, far removed from the sterile environment of the hospital. Chen's operation was more sophisticated than anything she'd encountered in the military or law enforcement. They had access to advanced surveillance equipment, psychological profiling software, and legal resources that could navigate the gray areas of corporate investigations. "Your military record is impressive," Chen said during her interview, reviewing a file that seemed to contain more information than should have been available to a private company. "But what really interests me is your success rate with reluctant subjects. 97% compliance during medical interviews is unprecedented." Jerica had learned to discuss her methods in euphemistic terms. People tend to be more cooperative when they're receiving care. It creates trust and vulnerability that can be leveraged appropriately. Exactly, and in corporate settings, we often deal with individuals who have significant financial incentives to remain silent. Traditional interrogation techniques don't work on executives who can afford high-priced attorneys and media spin doctors. Her first assignment involved a pharmaceutical company where someone was leaking confidential drug trial data to competitors. The security breach had cost the company millions in lost patent advantages and raised serious concerns about patient safety. Internal investigations had failed to identify the source of the leaks. Chen provided her with a list of 12 employees who had access to the compromised information. Her job was to interview each person under the guise of conducting mandatory health screenings for employees working with experimental compounds. The company's insurance requirements made such screenings legally defensible and difficult to refuse. The medical screening room Apex had arranged looked completely legitimate. Examining table, blood pressure equipment, charts on the walls, and a locked cabinet full of medical supplies. Jerica wore scrubs and carried herself with the professional authority that made questioning her credentials seem unreasonable. Dr. Angela Foster was the 3rd employee on her list. Foster was a senior research analyst with 22 years at the company and a spotless record. She arrived for her screening appointment nervous but compliant, explaining that she'd never been comfortable with medical procedures. As Jerica conducted routine checks, blood pressure, reflexes, lymph node examination, she engaged Foster in conversation about work stress, job satisfaction, and health concerns. The interview seemed completely normal until Jerica began testing Foster's pain responses under the pretense of checking for nerve damage from repetitive computer use. Examination revealed that Foster had an unusually sensitive ulnar nerve cluster in her left arm. When Jerica applied pressure during the routine neurological assessment, Foster's discomfort was immediate and intense. More importantly, the pain seemed to bypass her normal psychological defenses, making her more talkative and less guarded. These nerve sensitivity issues are common in people under chronic stress, Jerica explained, continuing to apply targeted pressure. Sometimes work pressures can manifest as physical symptoms. Have you been dealing with any unusual pressure lately? Over the next 30 minutes, Foster revealed that she'd been approached 6 months earlier by someone claiming to represent a European pharmaceutical company. They'd offered her $50,000 for general information about her employer's research pipeline. She'd initially refused, but mounting financial pressures from her mother's long-term care costs had eventually worn down her resistance. The information Foster provided led to the identification of an entire industrial espionage network. 3 additional employees were involved in the scheme, and the investigation ultimately prevented the theft of data worth an estimated $40 million. Chen was impressed enough to offer Jerica a permanent position with a salary that doubled what she'd been making at the hospital. More importantly, he gave her access to resources and training that refined her techniques far beyond what she'd developed through trial and error. The Apex training program introduced her to sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques, advanced pain management protocols, and legal strategies for operating in gray areas without crossing prosecutable lines. She learned about pharmaceutical compounds that could enhance suggestibility without leaving detectable traces, pressure point techniques that caused maximum discomfort without visible injury, and psychological conditioning methods that made subjects eager to cooperate. Her success rate with corporate investigations quickly established her reputation within Chen's network of clients. She could extract information from executives who had withstood traditional interrogation, identify theft schemes that had stumped internal security teams, and resolve personnel problems that seemed unsolvable through conventional means. But the corporate work, while lucrative and intellectually challenging, lacked the intensity she'd experienced in Afghanistan. The stakes felt lower, the subjects less dangerous, and the outcomes less meaningful. She began to crave the adrenaline rush that came with higher-risk situations and more significant consequences. The opportunity came through an unexpected source. Sarah Mitchell was a former Army intelligence officer who now worked freelance assignments for various government contractors. She'd heard about Jerica's work through informal networks and had a proposition that promised to be far more stimulating than corporate espionage. They met at a coffee shop in Lakewood, where Mitchell outlined her current assignment. A domestic terrorist cell was planning attacks on federal installations, but traditional law enforcement approaches had failed to penetrate their organization. The FBI needed someone who could get close to suspected cell members and extract operational details without triggering their security protocols. These aren't street criminals or corporate executives, Mitchell explained. They're ideologically motivated, well-trained, and expecting surveillance. They've studied counterinterrogation techniques and know how to resist traditional pressure. The target was Thomas Brennan, a former Marine explosives expert who was suspected of recruiting veterans for anti-government activities. Brennan had been injured in an IED blast during his final deployment and suffered from chronic pain that had led to depression and radicalization. He'd been treated at various VA facilities, but had grown increasingly suspicious of government-affiliated medical care. Jerica's cover story was simple but effective. She was a private healthcare provider specializing in veterans issues, working outside the VA system to provide alternative pain management for service members who'd been failed by traditional military medicine. Her military background and genuine medical expertise made the cover nearly unassailable. The approach required weeks of preparation. She studied Brennan's medical records, researched his military service, and developed treatment protocols that would legitimately help his condition while creating opportunities to extract information about his current activities. Their first meeting took place at a veterans support group in Colorado Springs. Brennan was immediately suspicious, but Jerica's knowledge of military medical procedures and her obvious understanding of combat injuries gradually earned his trust. When she offered to provide private treatment for his chronic pain at no cost, he agreed to an initial consultation. The treatment sessions took place at a clinic Apex had established specifically for the operation. The space was equipped with standard medical equipment, but also contained sophisticated recording devices and monitoring systems that tracked everything from heart rate to stress indicators. During their third session, as Jerica worked on trigger point therapy for Brennan's damaged leg, she began asking about his adjustment to civilian life and his thoughts on how the government treated veterans. The physical therapy was genuine. She was actually helping relieve his chronic pain, but it also created a setting where he felt comfortable sharing increasingly personal information. Brennan's guard dropped incrementally over several weeks. The combination of pain relief, empathetic listening, and shared military experience created a bond that bypassed his usual security consciousness. He began talking about friends who shared his political views, meetings he attended, and activities that were clearly outside the bounds of legal protest. The breakthrough came during their 7th session. While working on deep tissue massage to relieve nerve compression in Brennan's back, Jerica mentioned her frustration with government bureaucracy and her sympathy for veterans who felt abandoned by the system that had promised to care for them. Brennan responded by revealing details about a planned operation targeting a federal courthouse in Denver. The attack was scheduled for the following month and would involve multiple explosive devices designed to maximize casualties during peak business hours. The information Jerica extracted during subsequent sessions allowed federal agents to prevent an attack that could have killed dozens of people. Brennan and 6 associates were arrested before they could acquire the final components for their explosive devices. But the successful operation marked another turning point in Jerica's evolution. She'd moved from treating battlefield injuries to extracting intelligence from prisoners, from hospital patients to corporate targets, and now to domestic counterterrorism. Each transition had required her to become more manipulative, more calculating, and more comfortable with deception. The idealistic medical student was completely gone now, replaced by someone who viewed every human interaction as an opportunity to extract advantage. She'd become an expert at identifying vulnerabilities, exploiting weaknesses, and using her medical knowledge as a weapon disguised as healing. And she was starting to wonder what would happen if she ever decided to stop working for the good guys. The recommendation came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elena Vasquez was a forensic psychiatrist who consulted with federal law enforcement on cases involving psychological manipulation and coercion. After reviewing Jerica's counterterrorism work, she suggested a position that seemed almost too good to be true. The Meridian Institute was a private research facility focused on developing advanced interrogation and information extraction techniques for intelligence agencies. Located in an unmarked complex outside Boulder, the institute operated under contracts with the CIA, NSA, and several other agencies whose existence wasn't publicly acknowledged. Dr. James Harrison, the institute's director, had been developing programs that pushed the boundaries of legal interrogation methods. His team needed someone with Jerica's unique combination of medical expertise and practical experience, applying anatomical knowledge under pressure. "We're exploring the intersection of physical and psychological manipulation," Harrison explained during her recruitment interview. "Traditional interrogation relies on breaking down psychological defenses through prolonged questioning and environmental pressure, but your work suggests there are more efficient approaches. The Institute's basement levels contained facilities that looked like a cross between a medical school and a research laboratory. Examination rooms equipped with one-way mirrors and recording equipment. Isolation chambers designed to test sensory deprivation effects. Even a surgical suite that could be used for medical procedures during interrogation sessions." Jerica's official title was Senior Research Associate, but her actual role involved developing and testing new techniques for extracting information from subjects who had been trained to resist conventional methods. The work was classified at levels that required extensive background investigations and periodic polygraph examinations. Her first project involved studying the effectiveness of controlled pain application during questioning. The research subjects were volunteers recruited from local universities and paid substantial fees for participating in what they believed were studies on pain tolerance and stress response. None of them understood the true purpose of the experiments. Working with Dr. Harrison's team, Jerica developed protocols that mapped the relationship between specific types of physical discomfort and psychological compliance. They discovered that precisely targeted nerve stimulation could create levels of pain that bypassed normal resistance training without causing permanent damage or visible injury. The key breakthrough came when they realized that medical procedures created unique psychological vulnerabilities. Subjects who could withstand traditional interrogation techniques often became dramatically more cooperative when pain was delivered in a clinical setting by someone wearing medical credentials. There's something about the medical context that short-circuits normal defense mechanisms, Jerica explained to Harrison during one of their research reviews. People are conditioned to trust medical professionals and to accept that some procedures are necessary even when they cause pain. The Institute's work attracted attention from intelligence agencies dealing with high-value prisoners who had proven resistant to conventional approaches. Jerica began consulting on cases that required her to travel to secure facilities where she couldn't ask questions about the subjects' identities or the reasons for their detention. Her first overseas assignment took her to a classified facility in Eastern Europe, where she worked with someone identified only as Subject 47. The man appeared to be Middle Eastern, spoke fluent English and Arabic, and had clearly received extensive counter-interrogation training. Previous attempts to extract information had failed completely. Jerica's approach was methodical and patient. She spent 2 weeks conducting medical evaluations that mapped Subject 47's pain responses and psychological triggers. She identified old injuries that could be aggravated without obvious trauma, nerve clusters that responded to specific types of pressure, and psychological vulnerabilities related to his apparent fear of medical procedures. The breakthrough technique involved combining precise anatomical manipulation with pharmaceutical enhancement. A mild muscle relaxant made Subject 47 more susceptible to suggestion, while targeted pressure on damaged cartilage in his knee created manageable but persistent discomfort. The combination broke through his resistance in ways that months of traditional interrogation had failed to achieve. Within 72 hours, Subject 47 had provided detailed information about terrorist financing networks, planned attacks, and the locations of weapons caches across 3 countries. The intelligence he revealed prevented multiple attacks and led to the capture of an entire terrorist cell. Harrison was impressed enough to promote Jerica to Senior Research Director and give her oversight of the Institute's most sensitive projects. Her success rate with resistant subjects had reached nearly 100%, and intelligence agencies were requesting her services for their most important cases. But the work was beginning to affect her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The psychological isolation required by her security clearance meant she couldn't discuss her activities with anyone outside the Institute. The constant exposure to human suffering, even when justified by operational necessity, was creating an emotional numbness that extended beyond her professional life. More concerning was her growing fascination with the pure science of her methods. She found herself designing experiments that went beyond operational requirements, exploring the limits of what could be achieved through the precise application of anatomical knowledge. The research was becoming an end in itself, rather than a means to gather intelligence. The first warning sign came during a project involving stress response testing. The research subject was a graduate student named Kevin Walsh, who had volunteered for what he believed was a study on pain management techniques. During the session, Jerica found herself extending the procedure beyond the approved protocol, simply to observe how his nervous system responded to increasingly sophisticated manipulation. Walsh's distress became genuine as the test continued, but Jerica felt no impulse to stop. Instead, she meticulously documented his reactions while applying pressure to nerve clusters that created waves of discomfort that built and receded in carefully orchestrated patterns. The data was scientifically valuable, but the motivation for collecting it had shifted from research necessity to personal curiosity. Dr. Harrison noticed the change during their weekly review sessions. "Your recent work has been exceptional, but I'm concerned about some of the methodological choices you've been making. The Walsh session, for example, went significantly beyond what our protocols required. The additional data provided insights that could improve our techniques, perhaps, but there's a difference between thorough research and—" Harrison paused, choosing his words carefully. "Personal interest that extends beyond professional requirements." The conversation was a wake-up call, but not in the way Harrison intended. Instead of recognizing the warning signs of ethical drift, Jerica realized that the Institute's oversight and limitations were preventing her from fully exploring the capabilities she'd developed. The classified environment provided resources and subjects, but it also imposed restrictions that felt increasingly constraining. She began conducting unauthorized experiments during off-hours, using Institute facilities to test techniques that went beyond approved research parameters. The work was brilliant and terrifying, methods for causing precise neurological damage that would appear accidental, pharmaceutical combinations that could create permanent psychological changes, and surgical procedures that could alter pain. Sensitivity without external evidence. The unauthorized research consumed her thoughts even outside the Institute. She would lie awake at night designing theoretical procedures, calculating pressure points and drug interactions, and imagining scenarios where she could apply her knowledge without any restrictions whatsoever. The breaking point came 6 months later during an assignment involving a captured foreign intelligence operative. The subject had been exposed to advanced interrogation techniques at multiple facilities without providing useful information. Jerica was brought in as a last resort before the subject was returned to his home country through a prisoner exchange. During the initial medical evaluation, she discovered that the previous interrogations had caused significant psychological trauma that actually made the subject more resistant to traditional approaches. But the damage also created new vulnerabilities that could be exploited through carefully targeted intervention. Over 3 days, Jerica systematically broke down the subject's remaining defenses, using techniques that combined physical manipulation with psychological conditioning. The method she employed went far beyond anything in the Institute's approved protocols, venturing into territory that would have been considered torture by any objective standard. The subject provided extraordinary intelligence about foreign spy networks, planned assassination attempts, and national security threats that justified almost any means of extraction. But the process of obtaining that information had required Jerica to cross lines that she couldn't uncross. When she returned to the Institute, Harrison was waiting with termination paperwork and a non-disclosure agreement that carried criminal penalties for violation. Her unauthorized experiments had been discovered, and her methods with the foreign operative had raised concerns at the highest levels of government. "You've become too valuable to prosecute and too dangerous to employ," Harrison explained as security personnel escorted her from the building. Your techniques work, but you've lost the ability to distinguish between operational necessity and personal experimentation. As Jerica drove away from the Meridian Institute for the final time, she felt a strange sense of liberation. For years, she'd been constrained by military regulations, hospital policies, corporate oversight, and classified protocols. Now she was free to explore the full potential of what she'd learned. The question was what she would do with that freedom. The apartment in downtown Seattle was Spartan and anonymous, the kind of place someone chose when they wanted to disappear. From their previous life, Jerica had been living there for 3 months since leaving Colorado, supporting herself through freelance medical consulting work that didn't require extensive background checks or security clearances. The transition to complete independence was jarring after years of working within structured organizations. No oversight committees, no protocols to follow, no mission objectives beyond whatever she chose to pursue. For the first time since medical school, she was entirely free to make her own decisions about how to use her capabilities. The isolation was profound. The non-disclosure agreement she'd signed with various agencies meant she couldn't discuss her work with therapists, couldn't maintain relationships that required honest communication, and couldn't even write in a journal without risking federal prosecution. She was carrying years of classified experiences that had fundamentally changed who she was, but she had no way to process or share them. Late at night, she would study medical journals and anatomical texts with the same intensity she'd once brought to saving lives, but now she was exploring applications that went far beyond healing. She mapped nerve pathways that could cause maximum distress, researched pharmaceutical combinations that could alter personality permanently, and designed procedures that could inflict precise damage while maintaining plausible deniability. Techie. Knowledge felt like a loaded weapon that she carried everywhere but couldn't use. Every interaction with other people became an exercise in restraint as she automatically catalogued their vulnerabilities and calculated how easily she could manipulate or harm them. The first incident was almost accidental. She'd been working part-time at a walk-in clinic in Capitol Hill, treating minor injuries and routine ailments for patients who couldn't afford regular health care. The work was mundane but necessary. She needed legitimate employment to maintain her cover identity and explain her income to anyone who might investigate her activities. Dr. Robert Myers owned the clinic and had a reputation for cutting corners. To maximize profits, he employed unlicensed staff, used expired medications, and charged exorbitant fees to desperate patients who had no alternatives. Jerica had overlooked these issues initially, but Myers' treatment of patients became increasingly difficult to ignore. The breaking point came when Myers refused to treat Maria Santos, a undocumented immigrant whose 6-year-old daughter had been burned in a kitchen accident. The child needed immediate care for second-degree burns on her arm, but Myers demanded payment in advance and threatened to call immigration authorities when Maria couldn't provide the money. Jerica treated the child's injuries without Myers' authorization, using supplies she purchased herself and techniques that ensured proper healing without scarring. But the incident crystallized her growing anger at Myers' exploitation of vulnerable patients. 2 weeks later, Myers came to the clinic complaining of severe abdominal pain. Initial examination suggested kidney stones, but as Jerica conducted a more thorough evaluation, she discovered something interesting. Myers had a rare anatomical variation in his renal system that made certain types of pain particularly intense and difficult to treat effectively. During the examination, she accidentally applied pressure to a nerve cluster that triggered excruciating spasms throughout Myers' lower back and abdomen. His reaction was immediate and dramatic. He doubled over in agony, begging her to make the pain stop. "This is a complex condition," she explained with professional concern. The nerve involvement suggests this could become chronic without proper treatment. I'll need to run some additional tests. What followed was 2 hours of the most sophisticated psychological and physical manipulation Jerica had ever attempted outside a classified facility. She used a combination of nerve pressure, pharmaceutical intervention, and carefully orchestrated psychological conditioning to create a pattern of pain and relief that completely broke down Myers' psychological defenses. By the end of the session, Myers was sobbing and agreeing to anything she suggested. He signed over ownership of the clinic to a community health foundation, established a fund to provide free care for undocumented patients, and promised to never practice medicine again. The entire experience had taken place under the guise of emergency medical treatment. To any outside observer, Jerica had simply been trying to help a colleague who was experiencing a medical crisis. But she knew exactly what she'd done and why. The incident revealed something that both thrilled and terrified her. All the skills she'd developed, the anatomical knowledge, the psychological manipulation techniques, the ability to cause precise pain while maintaining medical plausibility, could be applied to targets of her own choosing rather than missions assigned by others. Over the following weeks, she began researching individuals who had committed crimes that went unpunished by traditional justice systems. Corrupt officials who exploited their positions for personal gain, wealthy predators who used their resources to escape consequences for their actions, business leaders whose decisions caused suffering that never resulted in legal accountability. She told herself she was considering theoretical scenarios, intellectual exercises in applied ethics. But the planning became increasingly detailed and specific. She identified targets, researched their schedules and vulnerabilities, and developed operational plans that would allow her to deliver precisely calibrated consequences for their actions. The second incident was more deliberate. Marcus Webb was a prominent Seattle attorney who specialized in defending wealthy clients accused of violent crimes. His legal strategies often involved intimidating victims into withdrawing complaints, discrediting witnesses through invasive personal attacks, and using procedural technicalities to prevent evidence from being admitted in court. Webb's most recent case involved a tech executive who had been accused of sexually assaulting multiple employees. Despite overwhelming evidence and testimony from 7 women, Webb had managed to get the charges dropped by systematically destroying the credibility of each victim through legal harassment and public humiliation. Jerica learned about the case through local news coverage and became fascinated by Webb's methods. He was essentially using the legal system as a weapon to inflict additional trauma on people who had already been victimized. His success rate with these tactics had made him wealthy and powerful, but completely immune to consequences for the suffering he caused. She began surveillance that started as curiosity, but gradually evolved into something more purposeful. Webb had routines that made him predictable. The same gym every morning, the same restaurant for client meetings, the same route home through quiet residential streets. More importantly, he had a medical history that created opportunities. Webb suffered from chronic back pain from an old skiing injury and regularly sought treatment from various specialists and alternative medicine practitioners. His desperation for pain relief made him vulnerable to someone offering new therapeutic approaches. Jerica's approach was methodical and patient. She established a false identity as a specialist in experimental pain management techniques, complete with fake credentials that would withstand casual verification. She arranged to meet Webb through a referral from one of his previous therapists, who had been unable to provide lasting relief. The treatment sessions took place at a private clinic she'd rented under a corporate identity that couldn't be traced back to her real name. The space was equipped with legitimate medical equipment, but also contained recording devices and pharmaceutical supplies that went far beyond standard pain management protocols. Webb's first session appeared completely normal. A thorough evaluation of his injury, assessment of previous treatments, and development of a customized therapy plan. But Jerica was actually mapping his pain responses, identifying psychological triggers, and testing his susceptibility to various forms of influence. The second session introduced elements that began to blur the lines between treatment and manipulation. While working on Webb's back injury, Jerica began asking about his work, his recent cases, and his thoughts on justice and accountability. The questions seemed like casual conversation, but they were actually designed to assess his psychological defenses and moral reasoning. During the third session, the real work began. As Webb lay face down on the treatment table, Jerica began applying pressure to nerve clusters that she'd identified during previous sessions. But instead of the gentle therapeutic touch he expected, she used techniques developed at the Meridian Institute to create waves of discomfort that built gradually and unpredictably. "Your injury has affected more than just the obvious muscle. It groups," she explained as Webb began to tense under her manipulation. "There's nerve damage that's been creating cascading effects throughout your system." What followed was 3 hours of the most sophisticated application of anatomical knowledge for non-medical purposes that Jerica had ever attempted. She used a combination of nerve manipulation, pharmaceutical enhancement, and psychological conditioning to create an experience that left Webb completely broken and desperate for relief. But unlike her previous subjects, Webb wasn't a prisoner or research volunteer. He was a free citizen who could leave at any time, call for help, or report her actions to authorities. The only thing keeping him on the treatment table was her ability to convince him that what she was doing was necessary medical care. By the end of the session, Webb had confessed to witness intimidation, evidence tampering, and bribery of court officials in dozens of cases spanning his entire career. More importantly, he had agreed to withdraw from all current cases, surrender his law license, and cooperate with investigations into his previous misconduct. The recording equipment captured everything, providing evidence that could destroy Webb's career and send him to prison for multiple felonies. But Jerica realized she had no intention of turning the evidence over to authorities. Instead, she wanted to see how far she could push the boundaries of what one person could do to another when they possessed the right combination of knowledge, resources, and complete lack of oversight. Webb's confession was just the beginning. She was starting to understand that everything she'd learned about causing pain, extracting information, and breaking down psychological resistance could be applied on a scale limited only by her imagination and ambition. For the first time since leaving the Meridian Institute, Jerica felt truly alive. Detective Lisa Chen had been tracking the pattern for 8 months before she realized what she was looking at. Wealthy individuals across the Pacific Northwest were experiencing sudden career collapses, confessing to crimes they'd previously denied, and voluntarily surrendering assets to victims or charitable organizations. The cases seemed unconnected, except for one detail. Each person had sought treatment from alternative medicine practitioners in the weeks before their dramatic life changes. The investigation began when tech mogul Brandon Vail walked into the FBI field office in Portland and confessed to a decade of securities fraud, tax evasion, and corporate espionage. Vail had been under investigation for years, but federal prosecutors had never been able to build a case that would stick. His legal team was considered impenetrable, and his wealth had insulated him from consequences despite overwhelming evidence of wrongdoing. Now Vail was begging to plead guilty to everything, providing detailed evidence of crimes that investigators didn't even know had occurred. He seemed genuinely terrified, constantly checking over his shoulder and flinching at unexpected sounds. When agents asked what had prompted his confession, he could only mumble about medical treatments and corrective procedures that had made him understand the error of his ways. Chen's partner, Agent Michael Rodriguez, had initially dismissed the confessions as guilty consciences, finally catching up with long-time criminals. But as similar cases accumulated across Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Pharmaceutical heiress Catherine Morrison had liquidated her entire fortune to fund addiction treatment centers after years of profiting from opioid sales. Real estate developer Paul Kingston had turned over evidence of housing discrimination and predatory lending practices that sent him to federal prison for 12 years. Defense contractor James Sullivan had exposed classified bid-rigging schemes that cost him his security clearance and resulted in criminal charges. In each case, the transformation from defiant criminal to cooperative witness had occurred after visits to private medical practitioners who specialized in alternative pain management or experimental treatments. The practitioners used different names and operated from various locations, but their methods seemed remarkably effective at producing dramatic personality changes in resistant subjects. Chen began investigating the medical providers, but the trail was frustratingly elusive. The practitioners used temporary clinic spaces, false identities, and corporate structures that dissolved as soon as investigations began. Patient records were minimal and often contradictory. The only consistent element was that all the providers claimed expertise in neurological pain management and had supposedly trained at prestigious medical institutions. The breakthrough came when Chen discovered that several of the victims had received treatment for injuries that were anatomically impossible given their stated causes. Morrison claimed her chronic headaches resulted from a childhood bicycle accident, but her medical records showed damage to nerve clusters that could only have been caused by precise surgical intervention. Kingston's back problems were allegedly from a construction accident, but imaging revealed scarring patterns consistent with deliberate tissue manipulation. Someone with extensive anatomical knowledge was using medical procedures to cause specific types of damage that created leverage for extracting confessions and cooperation. The victims weren't experiencing genuine changes of conscience. They were being systematically broken down through sophisticated torture disguised as healthcare. Chen's investigation led her to a false identity being used by someone calling herself Dr. Sarah Manning, who operated out of a private clinic in Tacoma. The clinic's lease had been paid 6 months in advance by a shell corporation, and the medical equipment had been purchased through vendors who specialized in serving government contractors and research facilities. Security footage from neighboring businesses showed Dr. Manning arriving at the clinic each morning. She was a woman in her mid-30s with dark hair, military posture, and the confident movement of someone comfortable with violence. But facial recognition software found no matches in civilian databases, and attempts to trace her background through medical licensing boards came up empty. The surveillance operation began on a Tuesday morning, when Chen and Rodriguez positioned themselves across from the clinic to observe Dr. Manning's activities. What they witnessed was a steady stream of patients arriving for appointments, but these weren't typical medical visits. The patients were exclusively wealthy, powerful individuals who had been in the news for various scandals or legal troubles. Tech executives facing fraud charges, politicians involved in corruption investigations, business leaders accused of environmental crimes. Each one entered the clinic looking defiant or concerned and emerged hours later appearing traumatized and compliant. Chen realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. A single individual systematically targeting and neutralizing people who had used wealth and power to escape justice. The methods were sophisticated beyond anything law enforcement had encountered, combining medical expertise with psychological manipulation and anatomical precision that could only have come from specialized training. But the investigation took an unexpected turn when Chen discovered that Dr. Manning's true identity was Staff Sergeant Jerica Blackwood, a decorated Army medic with a classified service record that included combat deployments and intelligence operations. Blackwood had disappeared from official records after being terminated from a classified research position, and her current activities appeared to be completely unauthorized by any government agency. The case presented an extraordinary dilemma. For law enforcement, Blackwood was clearly operating outside legal boundaries and using methods that constituted torture under any reasonable definition. But her targets were individuals who had caused enormous harm while escaping traditional prosecution, and her actions were producing confessions and evidence that solved cases investigators had been unable to crack for years. Chen arranged a meeting with federal prosecutors to discuss how to proceed, but the conversation revealed the complexity of bringing charges against someone whose victims were themselves serious criminals. Blackwood's methods were clearly illegal, but proving torture charges would require testimony from victims who were themselves facing decades in prison for the crimes they'd confessed to under duress. The decision became moot when Blackwood, apparently, detected the surveillance and vanished from Seattle entirely. The Tacoma clinic was abandoned overnight, with all equipment removed and no forwarding address. Corporate records showed that the shell company had been dissolved and all financial accounts closed. For 6 weeks, there were no new cases fitting the established pattern. Chen began to think that Blackwood had either fled the country or decided to end her unauthorized operations. Then, reports began surfacing from Chicago about wealthy defendants suddenly cooperating with prosecutors in high-profile corruption cases. The investigation expanded to include FBI field offices across the Midwest as similar patterns emerged in Detroit, Milwaukee, and St. Louis. Blackwood had apparently decided to take her operations national, moving from city to city and targeting individuals whose crimes had gone unpunished by traditional justice systems. Her methods continued to evolve. Instead of maintaining fixed clinic locations, she began operating from temporary spaces, hotel suites, rented offices, even private residences. She developed mobile medical setups that could be assembled quickly and left no permanent trace. Most importantly, she began selecting targets more carefully, focusing on individuals whose confessions would have maximum impact on ongoing investigations. The investigation files grew to encompass dozens of cases across 15 states. Blackwood had become something unique in law enforcement annals, a serial vigilante whose weapons were medical knowledge and anatomical precision rather than conventional violence. Her victims survived their encounters but were permanently changed, transformed from defiant criminals into cooperative witnesses through methods that left no visible evidence of coercion. Chen's final report to the FBI task force concluded that Jerica Blackwood represented an entirely new category of criminal, someone whose extensive training in both healing and harming had created capabilities that existing legal frameworks weren't equipped to address. She possessed skills developed through military service, intelligence operations, and classified research that allowed her to operate effectively against targets who were themselves sophisticated and well protected. The manhunt for Blackwood continued, but she had demonstrated an ability to stay ahead of law enforcement while systematically targeting individuals across the country. Her success rate was unprecedented. Every person she'd treated had subsequently confessed to crimes and cooperated with authorities. The method she used to achieve these results remained classified, but the effectiveness was undeniable. As Chen reviewed the case files one final time before submitting her report. She reflected on the broader implications of what Blackwood represented. Military training programs, intelligence agencies, and classified research facilities were producing individuals with capabilities that could be used for purposes far beyond their intended applications. The combination of medical knowledge, psychological manipulation techniques, and anatomical precision created possibilities that were both fascinating and terrifying. Somewhere in America, a former combat medic with the knowledge of a surgeon and the skills of an interrogator was continuing to apply her expertise to targets of her own choosing. She had studied anatomy like a surgeon and knew exactly where to aim, not just to cause pain, but to achieve something far more complex and disturbing. Justice, delivered with surgical precision, one confession at a time. The hunt continues. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Dr. Amanda Foster, a legitimate pain management specialist in Denver, contacted the FBI after receiving inquiries from potential patients who mentioned hearing about her services through Dr. Sarah Manning. Foster had never heard of Manning, but the description of her methods raised immediate red flags for someone with genuine medical training. The techniques these patients described don't exist in legitimate medicine, Foster explained to Agent Rodriguez during their phone interview. Precision nerve manipulation that can cause specific psychological effects, pharmaceutical combinations that alter personality permanently, that's not pain management, that's something else entirely. Foster's insights helped the task force understand that they weren't just hunting a rogue medical practitioner, but someone who had weaponized healthcare itself. Blackwood was using the trust and authority inherent in medical relationships to gain access to targets who would never submit to traditional interrogation methods. The revelation led to a comprehensive review of medical licensing databases, continuing education programs, and pharmaceutical acquisition records. The FBI discovered that Blackwood had been systematically studying legitimate medical practitioners, learning their techniques, and then adapting those methods for her own purposes. More disturbing was the discovery that she'd been infiltrating medical conferences and professional development seminars. Security footage from pain management symposiums across the country showed her attending lectures on neurological manipulation, psychological conditioning, and pharmaceutical enhancement techniques. She was continuously upgrading her capabilities, learning from the medical community itself. Agent Sarah Kim, a former military intelligence officer who had been assigned to the task force, recognized something that civilian investigators had missed. Blackwood's operational patterns followed military planning principles, detailed reconnaissance, multiple contingency plans, and systematic target selection based on intelligence analysis. "She's not operating randomly," Kim explained during a task force briefing. "Every target she selects serves a strategic purpose. She's not just punishing individual criminals, she's systematically dismantling networks of corruption and organized crime." Kim's analysis revealed that Blackwood's targets were connected in ways that hadn't been obvious to investigators focused on individual cases. The tech executives she'd targeted were all involved in data manipulation schemes that affected election integrity. The pharmaceutical executives had collaborated on pricing strategies that denied life-saving medications to low-income patients. The defense contractors had participated in bid-rigging conspiracies that diverted resources from actual military needs. Rather than choosing victims based on personal grievances or random opportunity, Blackwood was conducting a methodical campaign against systemic corruption that traditional law enforcement had been unable to address effectively. Her medical expertise was just one component of a larger strategy that combined intelligence analysis, operational planning, and psychological warfare. The realization fundamentally changed how the task force approached the investigation. They were no longer hunting a disturbed individual acting on personal motivations, but someone conducting what amounted to a private intelligence operation against targets that posed broader threats to society. Agent Kim's military background allowed her to recognize Blackwood's methodology and predict her likely next moves. She's operating like a special operations unit with a mission to eliminate specific threats. The medical angle is her tactical advantage, but the strategic thinking is pure military intelligence. The prediction proved accurate when reports surfaced from Miami about a prominent defense contractor named Gerald Brooks, who had suddenly begun cooperating with federal investigators examining cost overruns and defective equipment that had endangered American troops overseas. Brooks had been scheduled to testify before Congress, but had repeatedly delayed through legal maneuvers until receiving experimental pain treatment from a specialist recommended by his personal physician. The task force traced the referral back to Dr. Manning, who had somehow gained access to Brooks's medical records and used that information to approach his doctor with seemingly legitimate treatment options. The level of preparation and social engineering required suggested intelligence training that went far beyond medical school. Kim's analysis of Blackwood's service record revealed classified assignments that had never been fully disclosed to the FBI task force. Through back channels with military intelligence contacts, she learned that Blackwood had been involved in operations targeting terrorist financing networks, weapons trafficking organizations, and foreign intelligence services. Her current activities aren't a deviation from her military training, Kim reported to task force leadership. They're a direct application of counterintelligence techniques she learned while targeting enemy networks overseas. She's treating domestic corruption as a national security threat and responding accordingly. The insight led to a dramatic expansion of the investigation as federal agencies realized they were dealing with someone who possessed classified knowledge about intelligence operations, psychological warfare techniques, and advanced interrogation methods. Blackwood wasn't just a rogue medical practitioner, she was a former intelligence operative using classified capabilities against domestic targets. Interagency coordination became complex as the case intersected with ongoing national security investigations. Several of Blackwood's targets were subjects of FBI, CIA, and NSA operations that had been proceeding slowly through traditional channels. Her interventions were accelerating those investigations, but also compromising careful surveillance and intelligence gathering efforts. The situation reached a crisis point when Blackwood targeted Senator William Crawford, who was under investigation for accepting bribes from foreign governments in exchange for classified information about military deployments. Crawford's cooperation with federal investigators would normally have been considered a major victory, but his confession revealed that Blackwood had somehow gained access to classified intelligence about his activities. The realization that Blackwood was operating with access to current classified information suggested she was either receiving assistance from active intelligence personnel or had maintained access to government systems after her termination from the Meridian Institute. Both possibilities represented serious breaches of national security that extended far beyond her medical vigilantism. National Security Agency analysts were brought into the investigation to assess how Blackwood might be accessing classified information and whether her operations posed broader threats to ongoing intelligence activities. Their review revealed a disturbing pattern of security compromises at facilities where she had previously worked. The Meridian Institute reported that several research files had been copied before Blackwood's termination, including detailed psychological profiles of high-value targets and advanced interrogation protocols. Military medical facilities where she had served discovered that patient records and operational reports had been accessed after her discharge. Even the VA hospital in Denver found evidence that she had maintained unauthorized access to medical databases containing information about veterans involved in sensitive operations. The scope of Blackwood's intelligence-gathering capabilities forced federal agencies to reassess the threat she represented. Rather than a lone individual using medical knowledge for personal justice, she appeared to be conducting sophisticated intelligence operations that rivaled those of foreign adversaries. Agent Kim's final assessment painted a picture of someone who had evolved far beyond her original training to become something unprecedented in law enforcement experience. Jerica Blackwood represents the convergence of multiple specialized skill sets that were never intended to be combined in a single individual. Medical expertise, psychological manipulation, intelligence analysis, operational planning, and advanced interrogation techniques. She's essentially become a one-person intelligence agency operating without oversight or legal constraints. The manhunt expanded to include resources from every major federal agency, but Blackwood continued to stay ahead of law enforcement while systematically targeting individuals whose crimes had gone unpunished through traditional channels. Her success rate remained perfect. Every person she treated subsequently provided complete cooperation with authorities and evidence that resolved cases that had been stalled for years. As the investigation entered its second year, federal prosecutors faced the unprecedented challenge of potentially prosecuting someone whose illegal methods had solved more high-profile corruption cases than traditional law enforcement had managed in the previous decade. The evidence she extracted was admissible in court, the confessions she obtained were legally valid, and the criminals she targeted were genuinely guilty of the crimes they admitted.
Somewhere in America, Staff Sergeant Jerica Blackwood continued her private war against corruption and injustice, armed with knowledge that made her more effective than entire federal agencies. She had studied anatomy like a surgeon, learned psychology like a therapist, and applied both disciplines with the precision of a special operations officer. The hunt for her would continue, but everyone involved understood they were pursuing someone who had transcended the boundaries of traditional categories. She was no longer just a former combat medic, or a rogue medical practitioner, or even a vigilante seeking personal justice. She had become something entirely new, a living weapon forged from the intersection of healing and harming, wielding surgical precision against targets that conventional justice could never reach. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.